The evening air was thick with the clinking of glasses and the quiet hum of conversations, all blending with the aroma of food drifting from the kitchen. Lena's hands moved deftly as she wiped down tables, swept up crumbs, and reset napkins and silverware with practiced precision. She was the last to leave each night, a role she accepted willingly, as it gave her a little more time to herself before heading home to her 3 young children. Tonight, however, Lena had a different plan in mind. With the final guests gone and her coworkers already clocked out, Lena crept into the kitchen. She moved quietly, listening for any sounds that might suggest someone was still lingering in the back. Most nights, she packed a few extra bread rolls or some leftover vegetables that would otherwise be discarded, slipping them carefully into a worn grocery bag she brought from home. These small bits of food were enough to help her stretch out meals for her children, something that had become increasingly necessary since the bills had started piling up. Tonight, though, was different. In the middle of the kitchen counter sat a whole, untouched platter of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and steamed vegetables. It had been ordered by a group of regulars who, halfway through their meal, were interrupted by an emergency call. They'd left in a rush, barely touching their food, and told the staff to leave it behind. Lena stared at the platter, her stomach clenching with both hope and guilt. This would be enough for at least 3 full meals for her children, and for once, she wouldn't have to water down soup or cut bread into thin slices to make sure there was enough. She knew Tom, the new boss, had strict policies about wasting food, though he hadn't yet clarified whether he would allow employees to take home what was left. Tom was different from the previous owner. The old manager, Frank, had been more relaxed, seeing it as better to let food be used than thrown away. But Tom had a new, hard-nosed approach, intent on cutting costs and improving profit margins. Lena couldn't take the chance of asking him directly, afraid he'd refuse or, worse, fire her on the spot. With trembling hands, she reached for the platter, carefully sliding the food into her bag. Her heart raced as she glanced around, feeling like a thief even though she was taking food that would otherwise be thrown away. She was so focused on packing the food that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her until it was too late. Lena. She froze, her heart stopping as she turned to see Tom standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He stood there, hands crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed on the bag in her hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lena's mind whirled, scrambling to think of an explanation, but no words came. "What are you doing with that food?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. His eyes never left hers, and Lena felt a rush of panic surge through her. She imagined herself begging for forgiveness, explaining that she was only trying to feed her children, but the words felt trapped in her throat, held back by the shame that made her cheeks burn. I'm sorry, Tom," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I shouldn't have. She looked down, clutching the bag as if it could shield her from his gaze. "I have kids," she finally admitted, her voice breaking. "And sometimes there just isn't enough. I didn't mean any harm." Tom's expression softened, but only for a split second before his usual businesslike demeanor returned. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he seemed to consider what to say. Lena's heart pounded, the silence stretching unbearably, and she wondered if this would be her last night working at the restaurant. "Lena," he finally said, his tone low but steady, "you should have come to me. Taking food without permission isn't the way to handle things, you know that." He paused, glancing at the bag again before continuing. "We all have our struggles, but that doesn't mean we can just do as we please." Lena bit her lip, nodding, her eyes fixed on the floor. She felt her chest tighten, a mix of shame and frustration building inside her. She wanted to explain, to tell him about the endless bills, the nights when she went to bed hungry so her kids could have enough to eat, but she doubted he'd understand. Tom had never shown any signs of empathy or leniency since he'd taken over. To him, it was all about the bottom line, efficiency, and keeping employees in line. "I'm sorry, Tom," she whispered again, clutching the bag tighter. She had half a mind to put the food back and leave it, but the thought of her children's hungry faces waiting at home made her hesitate. To her surprise, Tom didn't immediately tell her to leave. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he exhaled heavily, the sternness in his face softening just slightly. "Look, Lena," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I get that things are tough right now, especially with kids at home." He glanced at the bag again, then back at her. "But you should have asked. Taking food like this, especially without permission. It's just not how things are done here." He paused, as if weighing his options. "I'll let this slide tonight. But next time, come to me first." Lena felt a wave of relief wash over her, though it was tinged with humiliation. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears as she clutched the bag to her chest, murmuring her gratitude. Tom's face softened further as he watched her, and for the first time since he'd taken over the restaurant, she saw a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. She left quickly, her heart racing as she made her way home, overwhelmed by the close call but relieved that she'd managed to keep her job. As she walked home, she thought of the moment Tom had hesitated, the flicker of compassion she'd seen in his gaze. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as heartless as she'd feared. But the nagging fear of what could happen if she was caught again lingered, and Lena resolved to find another way to make ends meet, even if it meant swallowing her pride and asking for help. She pushed the thought aside for now, grateful for the night's reprieve, and focused instead on the faces of her children as they opened the door to greet her, eager for the warm meal she had brought home. The days that followed were tense and uncomfortable for Lena. Though Tom hadn't outright fired her, his reaction left her on edge. Unsure where she stood in his eyes, she sensed his watchful presence around the restaurant, a feeling that made her every move feel scrutinized. Each time she noticed his eyes on her, she felt a pang of anxiety, reminding her of how fragile her situation was. Her children had been delighted with the unexpected meal she'd brought home, unaware of the risk she'd taken to provide it. But to Lena, every bite had been laced with guilt, a reminder of the possibility that she could lose her job, the one thin thread of security that held their lives together. One evening, just before the restaurant closed, an elderly couple who were regulars noticed Lena moving a bit slower than usual. The couple, Edith and Harold, were known to be observant, always noticing small details about the staff and often engaging in small talk. Tonight, they called Lena over to their table, offering her a warm smile as she approached. "Are you doing all right, dear?" Edith asked, her voice laced with genuine concern. "You seem a bit more tired than usual." Lena forced a smile, trying to brush off the question. "Just a long week, I guess," she replied. But Edith didn't seem satisfied with the vague response. She exchanged a knowing glance with her husband before returning her gaze to Lena. "We've seen you here almost every night, working so hard," Harold chimed in, his voice gentle. "It must be tough, with the little ones at home and all." Lena's smile faltered slightly, touched by their concern but wary of revealing too much. The last thing she wanted was pity, or worse, for her struggles to become the talk of the town. She simply nodded and thanked them, promising to bring over their usual dessert. As she walked away, though, Edith's words lingered in her mind. It was both comforting and unsettling to know that people noticed her, that they could see the exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. She wondered how much they really knew, if they'd ever seen her slipping leftovers into her bag late at night. The thought filled her with a quiet dread. Later that evening, just as Lena was about to clock out, Tom approached her with a clipboard in hand, his expression unreadable. She felt her heart sink, anticipating another lecture, or worse, another round of interrogation about her actions. Instead, he simply handed her the clipboard and gestured toward the schedule. "I'm changing your shifts," he said abruptly, barely meeting her gaze. "From now on, you'll be on the lunch and early dinner shifts. It should give you more time in the evenings with your kids." Lena blinked, momentarily stunned. She hadn't expected such a gesture, especially from someone who'd seemed so unyielding. She felt a mix of relief and surprise, though her pride held her back from showing too much gratitude. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She watched as Tom nodded curtly and walked away, leaving her to process the unexpected kindness. But the reprieve was short-lived. With her new schedule, she now had to leave the restaurant before closing, which meant she couldn't rely on the late-night leftovers anymore. Her children quickly noticed the change. The meals she prepared at home became smaller, and Lena found herself making excuses, telling them it was just a busy time and that things would get better soon. In truth, she had no idea how to stretch her paycheck far enough to cover their needs. The fear of failure gnawed at her, and each day felt like a race against the ticking clock of bills and overdue payments. Then one afternoon, as Lena was serving tables during the lunch shift, she noticed a small envelope lying on the counter near her station. Her name was written on it in neat cursive handwriting, but there was no indication of who had left it. Curious and slightly apprehensive, she glanced around to see if anyone was watching before slipping the envelope into her pocket. She waited until her shift ended to open it, her heart pounding with a strange mix of hope and dread. Inside was a small wad of cash, along with a note that simply read, "For whatever you need. Use this however you see fit." There was no signature, no indication of who had left it. Just a plain, straightforward gesture of kindness. Lena felt a lump form in her throat as she held the money in her hands, her mind racing with thoughts. She didn't know who to thank, or even if she should accept it. Part of her felt ashamed to take charity, but the other part, the part that saw her children's faces each night, knew she didn't have much choice. She told herself it was a loan, that she'd find a way to pay it back, even if it took her years. She tucked the envelope away, resolving to use the money carefully, only for essentials. The mystery of the envelope lingered in her mind over the next few days. She began to notice small gestures from her coworkers and the regulars. Extra tips left on the table, a meal paid for in advance, or a kind word exchanged in passing. It was as if they all knew, in some unspoken way, that Lena needed support. She found herself deeply touched, realizing that while she'd been hiding her struggles, others had been quietly watching, willing to lend a hand without expecting anything in return. One evening, just as she was getting ready to leave, Tom called her into his office. She felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach as she stepped inside, bracing herself for whatever lecture or reprimand might follow. Tom's expression was hard to read, a mixture of sternness and something else she couldn't quite place. "I've been hearing things," he began, his voice low, "about you, and about how some customers have been going out of their way to help you out." He paused, watching her reaction closely. Lena felt her face flush, a mix of embarrassment and fear rising within her. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I get that people are fond of you," he said slowly, as if choosing his words carefully, "but this isn't exactly professional. I need to know that my staff isn't relying on charity or bending the rules to get by." His gaze was piercing, making Lena feel small and exposed. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't asked for the help, that it had been offered out of kindness. But her words felt trapped, tangled in her throat. Just as she was about to stammer an apology, something shifted in Tom's expression. He leaned back, his face softening, and for a brief moment, Lena saw a hint of understanding in his eyes. "Look, Lena," he said quietly, almost reluctantly. "I grew up in a family that struggled too. I know what it's like to be hungry, to worry about making ends meet. But you can't let pride get in the way of survival. If you need help, you should ask." The words hit her like a tidal wave, and for the first time in a long time, Lena felt a glimmer of hope. She realized that Tom wasn't as heartless as he seemed, that beneath his tough exterior lay a man who understood hardship, perhaps even better than she did. She managed a faint smile, feeling a surge of gratitude she couldn't quite put into words. Tom didn't say anything else, but the silence between them felt different, softer, almost understanding. As she left his office, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders, as if some unspoken burden had finally been shared. That night, as she walked home, Lena thought about the unexpected kindness she'd received, both from strangers and from Tom, who had shown her a side she hadn't known existed. She still didn't know who had left the envelope, but she felt a newfound resolve. She would find a way to give back, to pay forward the kindness she'd been shown, and to prove to herself and to her children that they were not defined by their struggles. The evening air was cool and crisp as she walked, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt a sense of belonging, a feeling that she was part of something greater than herself. And as she opened the door to her modest home, greeted by the eager faces of her children, she felt a quiet strength building within her, a resolve to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles that lay ahead. Over the following days, Lena found herself in an unusual rhythm. With her new shift hours, she had a bit more time in the evenings to spend with her children, a blessing that filled her with both relief and renewed determination. Yet the specter of her financial struggle never disappeared. Her mind was constantly calculating how to stretch each dollar, how to make each meal last just a bit longer, and how to prepare for the inevitable bills that loomed like dark clouds on the horizon. Still, the memory of Tom's words echoed in her mind, a rare moment of kindness that had left a lasting impact. He had softened, if only briefly, and shown her a glimmer of empathy she hadn't expected. She held on to that moment, hoping it meant things were beginning to shift. And in a small way they were. The customers continued to show their quiet support. Small gestures came her way almost daily, extra tips from regulars, a coffee left on the counter with her name on it, and even a few kind notes of encouragement from those who'd noticed her struggle. But Tom's scrutiny had not completely lifted. While he seemed to have accepted her situation for now, he remained watchful, his gaze sharp whenever he crossed her path. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for her to slip up, to confirm some suspicion he had about her. It was as if he were conducting his own silent investigation, trying to determine whether she was worthy of the subtle leniency he'd shown. Then, one afternoon, just as the lunch rush was winding down, a small group of out-of-town customers arrived. They were dressed in business suits, and their presence immediately added a layer of tension to the usually laid-back atmosphere. One of the men, tall and imposing, made a point of catching Tom's attention the moment he entered. Lena didn't catch their entire conversation, but she overheard enough to gather that these were investors considering buying into the restaurant, a potential lifeline that could provide Tom with much-needed financial stability. As Lena moved between tables, she couldn't help but feel a pang of anxiety. The last thing she wanted was for these men to scrutinize her as Tom did. The thought of being seen as some kind of liability gnawed at her. She made herself as invisible as possible, hoping to avoid their notice. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As she served their drinks, one of the men caught her wrist lightly, stopping her in her tracks. He was older, with a kind face, his eyes soft with curiosity. "How long have you worked here?" he asked, his tone polite but probing. "Just over a year," she replied, hoping her voice didn't betray her nerves. She didn't want to say too much, but the man's gaze held hers, expectant. "And how do you find it?" he pressed, as if sensing there was more to the story than she was letting on. Lena hesitated, glancing toward Tom, who was watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. She felt caught between wanting to express her gratitude and a deep-rooted fear of saying the wrong thing. But something about the man's eyes made her feel seen, in a way that was both comforting and unnerving. "It's a good place to work," she said simply. "The community is very supportive." She offered a small smile, hoping that would suffice. The man returned her smile, releasing her wrist. "Good to hear," he murmured, though his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than she was comfortable with. She quickly excused herself, her heart racing, as she returned to the kitchen. Later that afternoon, as the group prepared to leave, Tom approached her with a look that was hard to decipher. She braced herself, unsure of what to expect. "They seem to like you," he said finally, his voice low. "Asked a lot of questions about the restaurant staff. You make a good impression." Lena nodded, grateful for the compliment but uncertain where it was leading. Tom's face softened, just for a moment, and she could sense he was weighing his words carefully. "Those men are considering investing," he said, glancing over his shoulder as the group exited. "They could be exactly what this place needs to stay afloat, but they also want to know everything, every detail, every employee, every expense." A pang of anxiety shot through her. She suddenly understood his meaning. Any deviation from the rules, any hint of impropriety, could jeopardize the deal. Her heart sank, realizing that if they knew about her taking leftovers, it could reflect poorly on the restaurant and on Tom. That night, as she walked home, Lena felt a mix of guilt and resentment. She understood the importance of keeping the restaurant's reputation clean, especially if it meant securing its future. But it also felt unfair that she had to keep struggling quietly, her hardships concealed, just to keep Tom's business intact. The irony of it stung. She was part of the expenses he needed to manage, a burden he had to account for. Days passed, and Lena did her best to keep her head down, working as diligently as ever. Yet the tension between her and Tom grew thicker, an unspoken standoff. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was keeping something from her, some detail he hadn't yet revealed. It was as if he was waiting for the right moment for her to make one small misstep. Then, one late afternoon, Edith and Harold, the elderly couple, approached Lena as she was clearing tables. They'd overheard the news about the potential investors, and they offered words of encouragement, telling her they were proud of her hard work and resilience. "You're like family to us," Edith said, her voice warm and sincere. "We've watched you grow here, Lena. You've brought something special to this place, something money can't buy." Lena felt a lump form in her throat, touched by their words. She thanked them, her voice thick with emotion. For the first time, she felt a genuine sense of belonging, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, she was more than just an employee. But as she turned to leave, Edith pressed something into her hand. It was a small folded piece of paper with an address written on it. "If you ever need help, if things get too hard," Edith whispered, "go here. Ask for Mrs. Caldwell. She helps people like us, people who've had a hard time. Tell her we sent you." Lena glanced at the paper, unsure what to make of it. She wanted to refuse, to insist that she didn't need charity, but Edith's expression was so sincere, so filled with warmth, that she found herself pocketing it, whispering her thanks. That night, as she lay in bed, her children asleep beside her, she turned the paper over in her hands, reading the address again and again. She didn't know if she'd ever use it, but knowing she had somewhere to go, someone willing to help, filled her with a sense of quiet comfort. The following morning, things took an unexpected turn. Tom called a staff meeting, something he rarely did, and Lena's stomach twisted with unease. As the staff gathered in the small dining area, Tom's face was tense, his gaze serious. "I wanted to let you all know that the investors have decided to move forward," he announced, his voice steady but with a hint of relief. "They're going to provide funding for the restaurant. We'll be able to make some upgrades, improve the kitchen, and hopefully bring in more business." A wave of murmurs spread through the room as the staff exchanged looks of excitement and relief. But as Tom continued, his gaze settled on Lena, his eyes narrowing slightly. "However," he added, his tone shifting, "they'll be keeping a close eye on our operations. Everything we do has to be above board, no exceptions." The words were meant for everyone, but Lena felt them as if they were directed solely at her. She held his gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. She knew what he was implying, the unspoken warning that there would be no room for bending the rules, not anymore. Later, as Lena worked through her shift, she found herself wrestling with conflicting emotions. The investor's decision was a blessing for the restaurant, a chance for it to thrive. But for her, It meant walking an even tighter line, each step more precarious than the last. Toward the end of the night, as she cleaned up, Tom approached her. His expression was softer than usual, almost regretful, and she braced herself for whatever he was about to say. "You've done good work here, Lena," he said quietly. "I just want you to know that I appreciate it." His words surprised her, and for a moment she saw a vulnerability in him, a glimpse of the man beneath the hardened exterior. She nodded, murmuring her thanks, unsure of how to respond. As she left the restaurant, she felt a strange sense of resolution. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to face it head-on, with or without the support she had come to rely on. And as she walked through the quiet streets, Edith's note in her pocket, she felt a newfound strength, a quiet resolve to keep fighting, no matter what lay ahead. The next few weeks passed in a blur of long shifts, whispered conversations, and quiet acts of support from the regulars who had come to know Lena well. The investors' involvement in the restaurant brought immediate changes. New menus, new uniforms, and a sleek new look for the dining room transformed the place practically overnight. Tom seemed revitalized, more focused, and constantly on the move, implementing new systems and monitoring every detail with precision. It was clear that he was trying to impress the investors, who had promised ongoing support if the changes led to an increase in profits. For Lena, the changes brought mixed emotions. On one hand, she was grateful that the restaurant was stable and that her job seemed secure, at least for the time being. But on the other, the new demands Tom placed on the staff were relentless. Every shift felt like a test, with Tom watching closely to ensure that every task was performed to his exacting standards. It was as if he was determined to squeeze every last ounce of productivity out of his employees, a pressure that weighed heavily on Lena and her coworkers. One evening, after the restaurant had closed, Lena found herself lingering behind, wiping down tables long after the others had left. She could feel Tom's eyes on her as he organized receipts at the counter, occasionally glancing her way. She braced herself, sensing he wanted to say something, and sure enough, after a few minutes, he cleared his throat. "Lena," he began, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant, "I've noticed that you've been putting in a lot of extra effort lately." She looked up, unsure how to respond. Compliments from Tom were rare, and she didn't know if he was being sincere or setting her up for another round of criticism. "Thank you," she replied cautiously. "I'm just trying to do my best." Tom nodded, his gaze drifting to the freshly polished tables. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he spoke again, his voice softer, almost reluctant. "The investors are coming by tomorrow," he said, avoiding her eyes. "They want to meet some of the staff, get a sense of who's been holding things together here. I'd like you to be there. They'll be observing us, and it's important that we make a good impression." Lena felt a flicker of pride, though it was quickly overshadowed by nerves. She'd never been comfortable with being in the spotlight, especially in front of strangers who would be scrutinizing her every move. But she nodded, agreeing to stay late for the investors' visit. She knew this was an important moment for the restaurant, and for Tom. And despite everything, she still felt a strange loyalty to him, and to the place she'd come to see as a second home. The next day, Lena prepared herself carefully, trying to look as professional as possible. She arrived at the restaurant early, checking every detail to make sure everything was perfect. When the investors arrived, Tom introduced them with a level of formality that felt almost foreign. He was all smiles and handshakes, his usual stern demeanor replaced by a practiced charm that he rarely displayed. As the investors made their way through the restaurant, observing the setup and chatting with the staff, Lena did her best to stay in the background. But one of the investors, the same man who had stopped her wrist weeks earlier, approached her with a warm smile. His name was Mr. Klein, and he seemed genuinely interested in hearing about her experience. "So, Lena," he said, his tone friendly and approachable, "Tom tells us you're one of his most dedicated employees. How have you found the changes here?" Lena hesitated, glancing at Tom, who was watching the exchange closely. She knew she needed to be diplomatic, careful not to say anything that might cast a shadow on Tom's management. But Mr. Klein's gaze was steady, encouraging, and she felt a surprising urge to speak honestly. "It's been an adjustment," she admitted, choosing her words carefully. "We're all doing our best to keep up with the new systems. It's different, but I think we're all trying to make it work." Mr. Klein nodded thoughtfully, his eyes flickering with understanding. "And what about you personally, Lena?" he asked. "Do you feel supported here? Do you have what you need to succeed?" Lena glanced at Tom again, unsure how to respond. She could see a slight tension in his expression, a warning not to say too much. But something in Mr. Klein's gaze felt genuine, almost fatherly, and she found herself wanting to answer truthfully. "Working here has been a blessing in many ways," she said slowly, her voice steady. "But it's also been challenging. Sometimes it feels like we're all just trying to keep our heads above water." She paused, feeling the surge of vulnerability, and then added softly, "But I'm grateful for the opportunity." Mr. Klein's eyes softened, and he nodded, seeming to understand more than she'd said. He gave her a reassuring smile, then turned back to Tom with a look of approval. "You've got a good team here, Tom," he said, his tone warm but pointed. "It's clear they care about this place. I hope you're taking good care of them in return." Tom nodded, his smile tight but polite. "Of course," he replied, though Lena could sense the subtle tension in his posture. She felt a strange satisfaction at the exchange, a quiet sense that her hard work had been recognized, even if Tom was too proud to admit it openly. As the investors left, Tom turned to her, his expression unreadable. She half expected him to chastise her for speaking so candidly, but instead, he simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her contribution. The rest of the evening passed quietly, and as Lena finished her shift, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, though she couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. That night, as she walked home, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She thought about Mr. Klein's words, the way he'd seen her, truly seen her, in a way that made her feel more than just an employee. It was a small validation, but it meant the world to her, a reminder that her efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. The next few days brought more changes. Tom seemed to have taken Mr. Klein's words to heart, his approach softening just slightly. He wasn't exactly warm, but he was less critical, less exacting, and occasionally even managed a nod of approval when she finished a task. The atmosphere at the restaurant felt lighter, and Lena noticed that her coworkers seemed more at ease, as if a weight had lifted. But then, just as things seemed to be settling, a new challenge appeared. One evening, as Lena was locking up, she noticed a figure standing in the shadows outside the restaurant. Her heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening as she approached the door cautiously. As she stepped outside, the figure emerged from the shadows, revealing the familiar face of a former coworker, Jason. Jason had worked at the restaurant for years, but he'd left shortly after Tom took over, unable to handle the new management's rigid policies. He looked tired, his clothes worn, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that made Lena's heart ache. "Lena," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I didn't know where else to go." She glanced around, making sure no one was watching, then gestured for him to follow her. They walked a short distance to a nearby bench, where they could talk without being overheard. "What happened, Jason?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. He hesitated, looking down at his hands, his face lined with worry. "I've been struggling since I left," he admitted. "I thought I'd find another job easily, but things haven't gone the way I'd hoped. I'm out of money, Lena. I don't know what to do." Lena felt a pang of empathy, her heart breaking for her old friend. She knew what it was like to be on the edge, to feel like you're one step away from losing everything. Without thinking, she reached into her bag and pulled out a few bills, pressing them into his hand. "Take this," she said softly. "It's not much, but it might help." Jason looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude, and she felt a surge of warmth, a reminder of the community that had quietly supported her in her own time of need. She knew that helping Jason wouldn't change her own struggles, but it was a small act of kindness, a way to pay forward the generosity she'd been shown. As she walked home that night, Lena felt a strange sense of peace. She knew her life was far from perfect, that the challenges she faced were far from over. But she also knew that she wasn't alone, that there were people around her who cared, who understood. In that moment, she realized that her strength didn't come from the absence of hardship, but from her ability to endure it, to keep going, to find hope even in the darkest of times. And as she looked up at the stars above, she felt a quiet certainty that no matter what lay ahead, she would face it with courage and compassion, a force stronger than any obstacle she might encounter. As the weeks turned into months, Lena began to settle into a fragile sense of stability. The restaurant had found its rhythm under the new investor's guidance, and though Tom still maintained his strict standards, his harsh edges had softened slightly. Lena, too, had adjusted to the demands, learning to navigate the constant pressures of her job while balancing the needs of her family. Each night, she returned home exhausted but grateful, clinging to the slim sense of security her work provided. But stability, as Lena knew all too well, was fleeting. One cold winter evening, as she was preparing to close up, Tom approached her with a look of urgency. "We need to talk, Lena," he said, glancing over his shoulder to ensure they were alone. She noticed the worry etched on his face, a look she'd rarely seen before. Lena followed him to the small office at the back of the restaurant, her heart pounding with unease. Tom closed the door and motioned for her to sit, an unusual gesture that immediately put her on edge. "I'm going to be honest with you," he began, his voice low and tense. "The investors, they're not entirely happy with the numbers. They've seen improvements, but they want more. They're threatening to pull out if we don't hit certain targets by the end of the quarter." Lena's stomach twisted at his words. She'd come to rely on the stability the investors had brought, and the thought of them withdrawing their support filled her with dread. She could only imagine what it would mean for the restaurant, and for her job, if they decided to cut their losses. What can we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he considered her question. "I'm working on a plan," he said finally. "I've been looking for ways to cut costs, streamline operations, but I can't do it alone. I need everyone on board, including you." Lena nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle heavily on her shoulders. She understood what he was asking, that he needed her to work harder, to go above and beyond to help the restaurant survive. And though she was already stretched thin, she knew she couldn't say no. Her job, and her children's future, depended on it. The following days were grueling. Tom pushed the staff harder than ever, implementing new protocols and monitoring every detail with relentless precision. Lena found herself working longer hours, often staying late into the night to ensure everything was perfect. Her body ached, her mind was exhausted, and her time with her children grew shorter, but she kept going, driven by a fierce determination to keep her family afloat. One evening, as she was closing up, she noticed Tom standing by the door, his gaze distant and troubled. She hesitated, then approached him, sensing that he was carrying a burden heavier than he was willing to admit. "Are you all right, Tom?" she asked gently, surprising herself with her own concern. He looked at her, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he nodded. "Just a lot on my mind," he replied, his voice weary. "I never thought it would be this hard. I knew the restaurant needed help, but the pressure from the investors, it's more than I expected." Lena could see the toll it was taking on him, the strain etched into his features. In that moment, she felt a pang of empathy, a reminder that despite their differences, they were both struggling to keep their heads above water. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. "We're all here to help. We want the restaurant to succeed just as much as you do." Tom's expression softened, and for the first time, She saw a vulnerability in him that he usually kept hidden. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her support, and they shared a brief, understanding smile before parting ways. The following morning, Lena arrived at the restaurant to find a surprise waiting for her. Edith and Harold, the elderly couple who had always shown her kindness, were sitting at a table near the front, smiling warmly as she approached. "Good morning, dear," Edith greeted her, a twinkle of excitement in her eyes. "We've been waiting for you. We have something we wanted to share." Lena felt a rush of curiosity, wondering what they had planned. Edith reached into her purse and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper, handing it to Lena with a look of pride. "We heard about the challenges the restaurant's been facing," Harold explained. "So we decided to organize a little fundraiser in the community. We thought it would be a good way to show our support and to let people know how much this place means to all of us." Lena unfolded the paper, her eyes widening as she read the list of names and donation amounts. Dozens of people from the community had contributed, each donation a small but meaningful gesture of support for the restaurant. She felt a lump form in her throat, overwhelmed by the kindness and generosity of the people around her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what to say." Edith reached out, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to say anything, dear. We're just happy to help. You've brought so much warmth and kindness to this place, Lena. It's only right that we give a little back." As Lena looked around the room, she saw other regulars smiling and nodding, their faces filled with encouragement and pride. It was a reminder that she wasn't just an employee. She was part of something larger, a community that valued her and the work she did. That evening, as she shared the news with Tom, she saw a rare smile break across his face. He was genuinely touched, the weight of his struggles momentarily lifted by the outpouring of support from the community. This changes everything," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I had no idea people cared this much." Lena smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. They care because this place means something to them. It's not just a restaurant. It's a part of their lives, a place where they feel at home. Tom nodded, a new determination lighting up his eyes. "Then we'll make it work. We'll find a way to keep going, for them and for us." In the weeks that followed, the fundraiser became a turning point for the restaurant. News of the community's support spread, drawing in new customers who wanted to be part of the story. Local businesses offered to help, providing supplies and services at discounted rates, and volunteers came forward to assist with renovations and maintenance. Lena watched with awe as the restaurant transformed, not just physically, but emotionally. It became a place of connection, a symbol of resilience and unity that resonated deeply with everyone who walked through its doors. One evening, as Lena was finishing her shift, Mr. Klein, the investor who had always shown her kindness, returned to the restaurant. He approached her with a smile, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "I heard about the fundraiser," he said, his tone warm and admiring. "I have to say, Lena, I'm impressed. You've done something remarkable here. You've created a place where people feel like they belong." Lena felt a surge of gratitude, humbled by his words. "It wasn't just me," she replied, glancing around at her coworkers and the familiar faces of the regulars. "It was everyone. We all came together to make this happen." Mr. Klein nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, we could use someone with your spirit and dedication in our organization. If you're ever interested in a new opportunity, let me know. I think you'd be a valuable addition to our team." The offer took her by surprise, and she felt a thrill of possibility spark within her. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged her potential, seen her as more than just a waitress struggling to make ends meet. She thanked him, promising to consider his offer, though her heart was torn. The restaurant had become her second home, a place that held memories and connections she couldn't easily leave behind. As Mr. Klein left, Lena looked around the bustling restaurant, the sounds of laughter and conversation filling the air. She realized that no matter where life took her, This place would always hold a special place in her heart. That night, as she walked home, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had come so far, faced so many challenges, yet through it all, she had discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had built a community, a family, and a future filled with hope. And as she looked up at the stars, she whispered a silent promise to herself to keep going, to keep giving, and to carry the spirit of resilience and kindness with her, wherever her journey might lead. As Lena settled into her role at the restaurant, a sense of contentment began to fill her days. The fundraiser had not only secured the restaurant's future, but had also solidified her place within the community. She was no longer just a waitress, but a central figure in the town's heart, the person everyone trusted to keep their favorite gathering place running smoothly. With Mr. Klein's offer still fresh in her mind, Lena found herself at a crossroads, uncertain of where her journey would ultimately lead. Yet, as things seemed to calm, life had one final surprise waiting for her. One afternoon, as Lena was preparing for the busy dinner rush, a woman walked into the restaurant, immediately drawing Lena's attention. She was elegantly dressed, with an air of confidence that seemed out of place in their small-town establishment. Her gaze swept over the room before finally landing on Lena. There was a familiarity in her eyes, a spark of recognition that made Lena's heart skip a beat. "Are you Lena Harlow?" the woman asked, her tone both warm and assertive. Lena nodded, slightly taken aback. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you?" The woman smiled, extending a hand. "My name is Sarah Caldwell. I believe you may know my aunt, Edith." At the mention of Edith's name, Lena's face lit up. Edith had been a pillar of support throughout her struggles, her quiet encouragement giving Lena the strength to keep going. But what could Edith's niece possibly want with her? "It's nice to meet you," Lena replied, shaking Sarah's hand. "Is everything all right with Edith?" "Oh, yes, she's fine," Sarah reassured her. "In fact, she speaks very highly of you. She's told me all about the incredible work you've done here at the restaurant, how you've brought the community together." She paused, her eyes softening. "Lena, my aunt is a remarkable judge of character, and she seems to think you're someone very special. She asked me to come here today to meet you and offer you something." Lena was speechless, glancing around the restaurant as if to ground herself in reality. "Offer me? What exactly?" Sarah's smile grew warmer. "I run a nonprofit organization that focuses on helping families and individuals in struggling communities. We offer training, mentorship, and support for people who want to make a difference in their neighborhoods. After hearing about everything you've done here, my aunt thought you might be interested in joining our team, helping us expand our programs and bring more resources to places like this." The words washed over Lena like a wave, each one carrying a weight of possibilities she hadn't dared to consider. The chance to work with a nonprofit, to use her experiences to help others who were facing the same struggles, she could hardly believe it. "Me?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "But I'm just a waitress. I don't have any special skills or training." Sarah's expression was kind but firm. "You have something far more valuable than that, Lena. You have heart, resilience, and a genuine understanding of what it means to struggle and overcome. Those qualities are rare, and they're exactly what we need. I know this may seem sudden, but I believe you could make a real difference, not just here, but in communities all across the region." Lena felt a mix of excitement and apprehension swirl within her. She had always dreamed of doing something meaningful, of finding a way to lift others as she had been lifted. But the thought of leaving the restaurant, of stepping away from the life she had built, was daunting. Would I have to leave here?" she asked, her voice tinged with hesitation. Sarah nodded gently. "It would mean relocating, at least for the training period. But once you're settled, you'd have the flexibility to work in any town or city that needs support. And of course, you'd always be welcome to come back here whenever you wanted." Lena's heart ached at the thought of saying goodbye to the people she had come to consider family. The restaurant had been her lifeline, the place where she had discovered her strength and resilience. But as she looked around the room, she felt an undeniable pull, a sense that her journey wasn't meant to end here. As if sensing her inner turmoil, Sarah placed a reassuring hand on Lena's shoulder. "Take your time to think it over. You don't have to decide right away. I'll be in town for a few more days, so if you want to talk or have any questions, I'm here." Lena nodded, her mind spinning as Sarah left the restaurant. The idea of stepping into a new world, of using her experiences to help others, filled her with both excitement and fear. She spent the next few days in deep thought, weighing the possibilities and discussing the opportunity with her children, who were supportive and encouraging, despite their own reluctance to see her go. One evening, Lena decided to confide in Edith and Harold. She found them at their usual table, their faces lighting up as she approached. "Sarah made you the offer, didn't she?" Edith asked, her eyes twinkling with anticipation. Lena nodded, surprised by Edith's insight. "Yes, she did, but I don't know if I'm ready for something like that. I've never done anything like this before." Edith reached across the table, taking Lena's hand in hers. "Lena, you've already proven yourself. You've touched so many lives here, inspired so many people. That's not something everyone can do. I believe in you, and so does Sarah. You don't have to have a fancy degree or special training to make a difference. All you need is the heart to care, and you've got that in spades." Lena felt tears prickling at her eyes, Edith's words piercing through her uncertainty. She had spent so long seeing herself as just a waitress, as someone who was barely scraping by. But perhaps it was time to let go of that identity, to step into a new chapter with courage and purpose. The following morning, she met with Sarah, her decision finally made. With a deep breath, Lena accepted the offer, feeling a mixture of fear and exhilaration as she committed to the path ahead. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Lena informed Tom of her decision, and though he was visibly taken aback, he surprised her by expressing his support. "You've earned this, Lena," he said, his voice uncharacteristically warm. "You've done more for this place than I could ever thank you for. I know you'll make a difference wherever you go." Her last night at the restaurant was bittersweet. Her coworkers and regular customers threw a small farewell party, filling the air with laughter, stories, and heartfelt goodbyes. Edith and Harold presented her with a small pendant, engraved with a symbol of strength, a reminder of the journey she had undertaken and the community that had shaped her. As Lena looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had supported her, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had come to this restaurant as a struggling mother, burdened by life's challenges, and now she was leaving as a woman transformed, ready to embrace a future filled with purpose and possibility. On her final night, as she closed the doors for the last time, Lena took a moment to reflect on all that had happened. The restaurant had been her sanctuary, her training ground, the place where she had discovered her own strength. It had given her a community, a family, and a sense of belonging she had never known before. The next morning, Lena left town, her children by her side, and ventured into the unknown. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles she couldn't yet foresee. But she also knew that she carried with her the lessons and love of a community that had shown her what it meant to persevere. As they drove away, she glanced back at the town one last time, whispering a silent goodbye. She was ready for this new chapter, a journey that would take her far beyond the walls of the restaurant, into communities where she would make a lasting impact. In the years that followed, Lena became a force of compassion and resilience, dedicating herself to helping others navigate the same struggles she had once faced. Her work with the nonprofit grew, reaching countless families in need, and she became a symbol of hope and strength for people across the region. And through it all, she never forgot the people who had lifted her up, the small-town restaurant that had been her starting point, and the kindness that had changed her life. In time, she returned to visit, her children grown and her life filled with stories of the lives she had touched. And as she walked through the doors of the old restaurant, now bustling with new faces and memories, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her journey had brought her full circle, back to the place where it had all begun. And she knew that no matter where life took her next, she would carry this community with her, forever imprinted on her heart.